Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Mark Nelson. I'm professor of philosophy here and director and faculty liaison to the Dallas Willard Research Center here at Westmont. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this lecture and to introduce our speaker. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Brandon Rickabaugh, assistant professor of philosophy at Palm Beach Atlantic University in West Palm Beach, Florida. Brandon, of course, has all the right credentials. Like BA in philosophy from University of California, Irvine, master's degrees from Biola and Baylor University, PhD from Baylor University in 2020, where his dissertation on the conscious mind unified won the award for the outstanding dissertation of the year in the university. More importantly, he has a growing reputation for his books and papers in philosophy of mind, many of which have something to do with that very basic question: what kind of creatures are human beings? Are they merely complex automata made of meat? Or is there something more to them? A soul, perhaps. He's already authored or co-authored over a dozen papers and book chapters on such topics. But Brandon is also interested in how these topics intersect with Christian spiritual formation, and he's written about that too. In fact, I first came to know about Brandon Rickabaugh when a paper he wrote when he was still a graduate student was awarded the 2018 Research Article Prize by the Dallas Willard Research Center here. That paper, Neuroscience, Spiritual Formation, and Bodily Souls, co-authored with Steve Evans, made me think we need to get this guy to come here and talk sometime. When we learned he was going to be on campus anyway, as part of the Cultura Fellowship program co-sponsored by Patty and F. Martin, and we're very glad to see them here this evening, who also support the Dallas Willard Research Center, we jumped at the chance to have Brandon share his ideas with us. So Brandon will speak for somewhere in the vicinity of 50 minutes, and we expect to have time for Q&A after the talk. The intriguing title of his talk is Mechanizing Ourselves to Death: The Human Soul and Cultural Disillusionment. So please join me in welcoming Professor Brandon Rickabaugh.
Thank you so much. Welcome. It's going to be hard to live up to that. It's customary to tell a joke or something like that to get the people to like you. But I know enough of you in the room that I know that there's no joke funny enough to get you to like me. I'm getting some feedback here, so hopefully we'll take care of that. So I'm very happy to be here. This is a research project that I've been working on, or this topic is something I've been thinking about in the back of my mind as I work on my primary research topics, which are on the nature of consciousness and the soul, and how knowledge of the soul and knowledge of consciousness helps us understand what kind of things we are, how we relate to each other, know each other, how we relate and are known by God. So I'm excited to give this talk. I'm looking forward to the Q&A. I'll try to end a little earlier, because I'm very curious to hear any thoughts or insights or comments, corrections, or any of the above that you might have to offer. In a recent Variety article, William Shatner reflected on his 2021 voyage into space on Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin space shuttle. This is what he said: "I love the mystery of the universe. I love all the questions that have come to us over thousands of years of exploration and hypotheses. But when I looked into space, there was no mystery, no majestic awe to behold. All I saw was death. I saw a cold, dark, black emptiness. It was unlike any blackness you had seen or felt on Earth. It was deep, enveloping, all-encompassing. Everything I thought was wrong. Everything I had expected to see was wrong. It was among the strangest of griefs I have ever encountered. It filled me with dread. My trip to space was supposed to be a celebration. Instead, it felt like a funeral." So Shatner experienced what astronauts often experience and call the overview effect. It's an experience of witnessing the Earth's ineffable fragility, which results in a shift in one's worldview. one's perspective on humanity as a whole and their own humanity as an individual person, and radically impacts their own perceived identity. Now, what I find interesting about Shatner's experience is that I think that as dramatic as his experience seemed to be, I think as individuals in a culture, we've gone over or experienced a much more pernicious kind of overview effect. An unsettling experience of seeing that what we once thought was real, meaningful, and important for life is in fact an illusion. That is, we're in a time of widespread disillusionment. We've seen the main cultural institutions over the past couple of years fail us in many ways, unexpected ways. And any proposed source of publicly available knowledge on how to move forward on these issues, how are we moving forward as a culture in terms of reconciling with one another? How is it that we can really find and pursue justice? How is it that we can know how to handle a pandemic, healthcare, issues of the meaning of life, color, all of these problems and issues? And it seems now that any sort of publicly available knowledge that we thought was there is now gone and not even on offer. And those who do seem to offer it are suspicious. So the Natural Intelligence Council's Global Trends reported in the 2021 global societal landscape was described as disillusioned, informed, and divided. I think there's not a more accurate characterization of our culture as one of disillusionment. We've moved from a culture of disenchantment, where the world seems devoid of anything miraculous, to an experience of the world where not only do things seem not miraculous whatsoever and wonder is gone, but there doesn't seem to be any sort of hope for knowledge of anything meaningful to move forward. So it's not just that we don't know what to do, it's much more serious than that. It's that we don't even have hope that we could ever come to know what to do. So you could think about this as a kind of Kierkegaardian despair over despair, the sickness unto death, this despair over the fact that we are in a place of despair and we don't know how to get out of it. So this despair over a lack of knowledge. The experience of disillusionment is really fascinating in psychology. Most of the studies were done after the fall of the Soviet Union. Most of these experiences have been studied in really, really interesting terms that are quite telling. Experiences of disillusionment correlate with when one's core positive views of themselves, their ideas, and beliefs are discredited. And along with that being discredited, they have this very, very shocking experience of their identity of who they think they are, their view of themselves, and their core passions being stripped away. So there's an associated with a deep, deep kind of sadness, confusion, disappointment, and a loss of trust and hope. It's far more profound than disappointment. It's associated also in these studies with political polarization and widespread aggressive tendencies. Disillusionment correlates with a lack of perceived purpose. These seem to be indicative of our culture right now. Now, what I find interesting as a philosopher is that disillusionment in these studies pick out particular features of the human experience that are rightly classified as epistemological, issues of knowledge. So the disillusionment happens in terms of how it is that we see the world devoid of any trustworthy sources. It appears that everything is speculation with little to no depth. That what we thought we knew, we've come to realize is not the case, but now we're really incapable of coming to know. And so there are real deep struggles that people have with moving forward. Psychologist Peter Homans, who's one of the leading experts on disillusionment, he sees only 3 options for moving ahead for disillusionment. And I think looking at them themselves might be cause for disillusionment as well. So his 3 are: 1, paralysis. Maybe we just stay stuck. Second is that we disavow. And third is this sort of seeking after knowledge. You just try to push through the problem. Now, paralysis doesn't seem like an option. I think everyone knows that that's not a place that we can stay. Our hearts are just going to remain restless. Our communities will remain restless. We have it in ourselves to have these discussions, even if we're not aware of them, in every place and corner of culture. It's not going to go away. I'm not convinced that paralysis is actually even a sustainable or long-term response. The second is disavowal. To disavow, the literature right now in psychology that's dealing with this is very, very revealing in terms of its inability to provide, again, a life-sustaining answer. The psychological research on this right now suggests strongly that the best answer to disillusionment in our culture and in our personal lives is nostalgia. Nostalgia, the process of going back and revisiting those things that we now lament are gone. Now that seems to me to exacerbate the problem, and so I'm skeptical of these studies that suggest anything more than just a very, very short temporary fix, again, amongst a very, very small sample size of individuals that are studied in this project that are not going to do well for the people that are trying to live life well in any sort of intelligent way. Nostalgia does not seem to be any sort of real comfort. In fact, you might think it just is an exacerbation of the problem. Nostalgia, you might think rightly, is just a misunderstanding or a wrong evaluation of what went on in the past. It actually might be an expression of our lack of knowledge to evaluate what really happened. So that you can have nostalgia, that you can look back on something and see it as good or enjoyable, does not tell us whether or not that actually was good or enjoyable, or will remain as good or enjoyable. Certainly not anything that might be indicative of what's real in the world that could be counted on. So nostalgia doesn't seem to be it doesn't seem to be a reasonable answer, but it also doesn't seem to be the kind of answer that we long for. Longing for in a real deep sense of, it seems to be the case that there has to be an answer to this, because when I look around at other people at least, they seem far more important, more brilliant, and more beautiful than the world is telling us, at least, in terms of the widespread media coverage, or the way that, let's say, certain religious leaders are giving up on the truth of the gospel in favor of something else that's far more like mere entertainment as a distraction, which I don't think also is even possible, to be distracted from these things. We might try, but they creep in. So what I think we should think about in terms of a response to nostalgia would be something I'd like to call a return to reality. A return to reality, and I don't mean to suggest that we aren't in reality right now. That's a non-negotiable. That's just evident to anyone who will take some moment to reflect on it. But I mean to turn our attention to reality as it is, with the expectation and a hope that we can commune with it in some way that we can flourish again, right? Now that's the thing in question, but it's the only sort of hope that we have moving forward. In fact, if you're going to think of disillusionment in any real sense, it can only have weight in our lives if we assume that there is some kind of knowledge to be had, and this knowledge about the fact that we don't seem to know what we thought we knew. And that's only a problem in the depths of ourselves if we realize that there's a way to live in concord and not conflict with the world. And so the disillusionment, I don't want to say is a gift. That doesn't seem right, but it certainly is, when it's honest disillusionment and when it's right about what's wrong with the world, is an opportunity for us to seek out what is truly missing or has been robbed or that we've turned away from, right? What is real, what's good, what is true, what's beautiful, applied to life now in a way that is knowable and testable, in a way that a community could gather around. That's what's really important about knowledge. You could gather around nostalgia with some people, but again, I don't think that's going to be any more life-sustaining as your 25th anniversary reunion. Not anniversary, don't tell my wife I slipped on that. But your 25th high school reunion. It'll be fun for a weekend, maybe. Probably the flight is where it's going to be the most fun. When you show up and see the magnet, oh, no one's any better off than I am. I didn't realize. The nostalgia might wear off, right? What we need is something that's knowable, that we can gather around, that we can make progress on, that will help us build community again. Knowledge, I think, allows us to have that in a rich way, and it always has. So specifically, I want to argue tonight that we need to return to publicly available and testable knowledge of the human soul and the conditions under which it flourishes. I think that that's what's at stake and what's at the core of one of the main pieces that's at the core of our disillusionment. So here's my thesis. We have mechanized ourselves to death, literally, and the only way out of this is a return to reality, the reality of the human soul, especially as understood by Jesus. So to clarify, by death and mechanization, by death I mean our current widespread cultural disillusionment at the individual and at the societal level. That's the death. That's the despair over despair. By mechanization, I mean that we've abandoned the human person, the human soul, for a vision of ourselves that's reducible and not much more than aggregates of impersonal systems and collections of data. Those two correlate together. If you mechanize a person and a culture, the culture and the person become dead and disillusioned. And so recovery from that is to return back to our understanding of the human person as a fundamental unit of explanation and analysis, meaning it doesn't go into the subpersonal regions. I'll talk a bit about that in a moment to clarify, but that we look at the human person as an integrated whole that can be best or perhaps only accounted by when we tend to the details and depths and dynamics of the human soul. So my thesis might sound a bit extreme and maybe even unlikely, but that's just the job of any good philosopher, is to posit something that seems absurd. Now it's my job to try to clarify that and make it interesting, I hope. So what then does it mean exactly? What's at stake with this mechanization of ourselves to death? I think that if you look at the two different modes of explanation, the two different ways that we explain things just in general life, but derived principally from the sciences now, are a mechanistic or subpersonal mode of explanation and a personal or agent-centered mode of explanation. When you explain things in the personal mode, you'll cite the person, their intentions, and their ability to realize their intentions as the explanation. When you go the mechanistic route, you cite a property of something and how that thing changes with its property according to some fundamental bit of reality and a natural law. So, consider the fact that I love my family, I love my kids, and you want to explain a particular act of me loving my kids, taking them to Walt Disney World in Florida. They love that place. It's rough to go. The best thing I can do to keep sustaining myself through it and not falling into disillusionment is to see the wonder and smile on their face. But what explains that act of love, right? So on the personal explanation, it's going to be me, irreducibly. What explains that I love my kids or that I act to love my kids? Well, because I have this intention to do something wonderful that's going to be good for them. And I realize that intention by the powers that I have. It's not a whole lot as a professor, but I have just enough money to take them to Disney World. The gas is the hard part to afford, because that's like a good hour-and-a-half drive. But I've got some sort of means and intentions. My thoughts put me into action. Those actions are realized in my interpersonal dynamics with my kids. Mechanistic explanation is going to be the one that we hear most and are most comfortable with and might sound most plausible, but I want to argue is radically harmful and also radically implausible. And that's to say that what explains my loving my children in this case is not me. You don't cite me. You cite subpersonal mechanisms. You cite perhaps my brain chemistry, my neurological structure, or ultimately it's going to be the behavior of, say, quarks and gluons, and ultimately tracing its causal history back to the beginning of the universe, probabilistically or deterministically. That's the explanation of why I do what I do. Now, that's the explanation that I think we're more accustomed to in the way that we talk about human behavior, right? We don't often, when we do something wrong, especially now, we don't talk about choosing or willing to do it to fulfill some sort of intention of ours. Often we'll cite some sort of past experience that led me to or caused me to do some sort of thing. And it deeply deeply depersonalizes and starts to mechanize us. So you get this really strange phenomenon. I'm sure Westmont doesn't have this problem, but at just about every university I've looked at, you can get a PhD in psychology and never learn what a human person is. You'll study abnormal behaviors. You'll study neuroscience and neurobiology. You won't find, you might study how that how human behavior manifests itself at the cultural level, but you'll never understand what a human person is. Instead of talking about desires, you're going to talk about C fibers firing. Instead of talking about what it is that unifies a person's experience of inner healing, you're going to talk about a particular pattern of synaptic responses based on some sort of, serotonin uptake inhibitor or lack thereof, right? You're going to cite some things that have nothing to do with persons as such, right? And I want to say what's happened in our culture is the further and further along we've gone in depersonalizing ourselves, we started to treat ourselves and other people as mechanisms. And that's how you get means to treating people as means to an end, let's say. This is how you get a culture that is easily addicted to pornography, let's say, because it's totally divorced from the experience of yourself as a person and the other people that you're viewing or interacting with as people as well. It's also what makes it the case that one community can attack another community and not feel the sort of lack of humanity that you should when you harm another person. Because it's my slogan against that slogan. It's my cause against another cause. It's not me as a person with another person and the harm that I inflict on myself when I do something wrong, right? We've even lost sight of the fact that we inflict harm on ourselves when we inflict harm on other persons, right? And so it makes it the case that I'm not going to care so much about the kind of person that I become in my sort of pursuits. What I want to see is my flag standing. I want it to be the last thing slain. And now I cite again another subpersonal, non-personal sort of mechanism. So personal explanations and mechanistic explanations, I take it to be really, really important categories to understand our lives as individuals. If I start treating my kids as things that are not persons, I've got a problem. If I start treating myself as something other than a person, I've got a problem. This is why it's easy to work yourself to death, because you will start to identify yourself with some sort of causal output. Again, a mechanization. What's good about me is not what's going on inside. What's good is what comes out based on some sort of input. Well, now you're just talking about a black box. So from this picture alone, this sort of moving away from a personal explanation to a mechanistic explanation, I think it's really easy to see how we could become disillusioned. You could think about it this way. Imagine that you are a leading expert on artificial intelligence, and you're really, really good at looking at data displayed on a screen that you can read and see whether or not the machine that's exhibiting this data is a true artificial intelligence or just a computer that's sort of behaving as if it was. You get really, really good. You've got, let's just say you got a 95% success rate on this. And you also have this strong understanding based on your research that the only things that can be conscious are human persons, biological things. So machines can't be conscious. AI is not conscious. It behaves like it achieves certain things, but it's not conscious. Only we can be conscious. But then what happens one day as you're doing your work, you come to realize that what's being displayed on the screen is actually your data. But before you come to understand that, you've already judged it as, yeah, that's not an AI, and it's certainly not anything that's conscious. What has to happen in you is this radical shift where you find out that you're a machine that shouldn't be conscious. That's the sort of opposite of what's going on right now, right? I think we know that we're conscious. We know that we're valuable. We know other people are valuable. We know that we matter or we show up in a way, but we can't explain it because we have now come to see ourselves as machines, as mechanisms, right? If we could even talk about a self, right? Scholars that study persons are radically skeptical about there even being a self. Nothing, writes St. Augustine, would remain stable in human society if we determined to believe nothing that we could not scientifically establish. Now, that was the first cultural move leading to the kind of disillusionment that we've got now. A more recent move is recognizing the failure of science to deliver on providing for us a great life. The first move was thinking that science was the thing that could save us. The second move was realizing that it has not. And now we've moved into a point where whatever it is that the scientists do, they couldn't even provide us with a trustworthy answer right now anyway. Because we've come to find out that science is muddier than we expected. It's more politicized than we have expected. We found out that scientists are more human than we expected. So this is this third movement or iteration into what St. Augustine foresaw as, if you just trust in the science and think that that's the way to know everything, and everything that matters in the world is explainable in principle by science, you will lose a society. Quite literally, you will have an aggregate of people that no longer work together in civility, because there won't be anything that holds them together. You'll have an aggregate of parts, like a computer that you drop. Now, the greatest, I think, realization of mechanization and this sort of dogma of scientism and our election of the new priests in the neuroscientists and now tech moguls is showing up in the internet, social media, and neuroscience, and the coming together of all three of those things in artificial intelligence. And that's what I want to focus a bit on here. So what's interesting is if you think about what the internet and social media actually is, it's not a new thing. It's not a new thing. The internet, if you think about just what it is essentially a technology that limits knowledge, the availability of knowledge. You might not think that's what it is because it seems like it's an open book, but it's not. It's highly selected and tells you and informs you of, one, where you should go to look for what's good for you and others, but also who is the reliable source to get it, and then what's the appropriate means of getting that into you as knowledge, right? And Plato thought that this was a problem way, way back in his day. So he argues that we mechanize things in a really bad way for ourselves with just the invention of writing, because with the invention of writing came the outsourcing of our memory. Now that might seem a little extreme, maybe, but just think about how it is now that we can't remember a whole lot of what we used to remember with our phones now. And so there's actually a very popular thesis in cognitive science now called the extended mind thesis, and it's the thesis that because much of what you used to remember is now on your phones, that your mind actually extends outside of your body into your phones. Now that, I don't know how you buy into that view unless you've already bought into a very depersonalized, mechanistic view of yourself. But part of the lesson, I think, here, and one of the things that Plato was getting at, is that technologies are not value neutral. Technologies can't, it's not that they can just be used for something good or bad, but when they come into the world, they assume and express a vision of what a person is. And one thing you might think with the internet, or different versions of the way you make media available to people, is that the way that we use it teaches us and expresses to others that what needs to be shared with you does not require that I show up as a person to be with you. Now, this is a problem. One of the greatest human needs is to be seen as a person by another person. And we are continually moving in a direction under which I think we've lost sight of what it is to be a person, and so it's bizarre to be loved by someone. It's bizarre to be seen by someone. Right? When I teach in my spiritual formation class about interpersonal, the way that the Holy Spirit transforms us interpersonally, one of my favorite things to do is to just lock eye contact with a student and make it very awkward. Because we're not used to being seen this way. I mean, maybe you are, because you're not flinching. What's your name? Sarah, you're good, I can tell. Most students it feels awkward to be seen. It feels awkward to be seen. What? Should I have picked you instead? You're like, don't be so mean to this. You're so mean. You're depersonalizing her now. If you get anything from this, it will be that I'm a jerk. But you came to this, so it's your fault. What happens in our interactions, we place screens in front of each other, and so we don't see each other. Now, this is going on in the background, but an industry that has brought us into an addiction to these things that are radically harming us. We all know that, though, I think. That's something that's out there. It's not that, the issue isn't that I don't know that cell phone addiction or social media addiction is a problem, and if I knew it was a problem, I wouldn't do it. The problem is, why do I keep doing it when I know that it's a problem? And I think the way we should understand that is that the problem about social media is harming us at the level of mental health is just a reflection of a deeper, much deeper problem. So think about what gets called the social media self-improvement industry. It's one of the largest industries on the internet now. If you follow just pick out one of your friends, if you don't yourself, and they're going to be following some sort of person that is selling multiple sorts of things to you in order to improve your life, even if they're not telling you that, even if that's not what they're saying. Joe Rogan, very popular podcaster, that's what he's selling. He's selling a way of becoming a different kind of person, become like him, become like his guests. He won't tell you that, but he's selling a lifestyle obsession, a self-improvement sort of scheme. The social media assumes that human connectivity, podcasts, social media, is mechanistic, that you can reduce individual connectivity to bits of data, right? This is what you trade in for likes, let's say, or hearts, or whatever it is that's going to become the new thing. You get this anxiety because, oh, I want to be seen. If I post this in this way, people will respond to it. And then we assume that what they're responding to is me. If we thought long and hard about it, we would recognize, no, that's not me, but there's radical confusion about that now, too. Mark Kohlenberg, perhaps the leading philosopher of technology on this problem, has a very interesting account of this that's very, very telling. According to Kohlenberg, the current destructive social media self-improvement obsession, he argues, is a product of the Christian vision of life as the striving for perfection. In a chapter, he argues that Augustine, Aquinas, Teresa of Avila, among many others, their teaching is just a form of self-improvement that comes by developing what he calls a habit through repetitive practice or a performative exercise. Now, I know a couple of my friends back there that know Thomas and Augustine are sort of cringing, and anybody who's studied much about spiritual formation should be cringing too, because it isn't the case at all that if you study these Christian thinkers well, that they are selling any sort of mechanistic self-improvement scheme, any sort of performative exercise. Now, what I find telling about this is that this philosopher, who should know better, has missed the whole point of what Christian spiritual formation is about, largely because in the teachings of Augustine and Aquinas and Teresa, he doesn't recognize what a person or a soul is. In fact, the title of his book is Technologies of the Soul in an Age of Artificial Intelligence, but ironically, but indicative of our time, the book says nothing about the human soul or the conditions under which the soul flourishes. So I want to say, his sort of treatment of what Christian thinkers actually teach and practice in terms of what it's like to become more like Jesus is mistaken for a mechanistic picture because he's lost sight of what a person and what a soul is. The words of these profound philosophers and theologians are just lost on a culture that has become habituated towards seeing through people into their mechanisms. This is a big problem. Secondly, I think what's really telling about this is that mechanistic solutions, insofar as we'll ever find them plausible, will always be couched in terms of personal, non-mechanistic terms. So the solution that Kohlenberg gives is, he says, this is his solution. He says, we need technologies that help us understand ourselves in a relational way. So I saved you some money and time with his book-length treatment on this. That's what he says. What do we need? Technologies For what? I thought they were bad. Well, those that help us understand ourselves in a relational way. But notice what he sneaks in there. He talks about relations. Well, relations among what or who? If you don't have an understanding of what a human person is or what the soul is, you have no metric to know whether or not what you're doing is treating it in any sort of way that's good for it, in any sort of a relation that would constitute its well-being. So if you even buy into his thesis that we need technologies that help us understand ourselves in a relational way, you have to already understand what is a self and what is the relational way under which selves should commune with each other. And he lacks the resources to answer the problem that he sees. And again, his understanding of the Christian view of this betrays the fact that he just has no sense of what a person is anymore. Here's something that bothers me more, that keeps me up more often than these other problems. So if you go onto the Apple Store, don't do it right now. If you go on there, you will find a large number of mental health apps, some of which use AI, and more are growing in their use of that. Very recently, Robert Morris, the co-founder of Coco, which is an online mental health service, announced on Twitter that Coco had, quote, provided mental health support to about 4,000 people using GPT-3. GPT-3 is the precursor to what everyone's talking about right now with Chat GPT. It's a chat bot. This chatbot, in November, I believe it was, had already provided mental health services to 4,000 people. Now, I don't know how, I have my own mental health struggles. I take it very, very seriously. And I've walked alongside a lot of people with mental health struggles. Part of the struggle is not recognizing that you are a person instead of something that's reducible to your problems, reducible to your failures or your harms or your traumas, that you are just those things. Again, a mechanized version of yourself. Now, I wonder what this technology seems to be doing is taking advantage of a group of people that can't see themselves as persons to give them an impersonal therapy that will exacerbate the problem by keeping themselves away from themselves in the eyes of other people. This is a problem. But you could think about it in a simpler way, which is how all the professors are thinking about it right now, and that's, can students use GPT to write papers that are passable? And we're finding out that with the humanities at least, it's not going to be able to do well. Well, if you don't think they're going to do well on writing passable papers, why would you ever think that they would be helpful in terms of therapeutic purposes for individuals that are in great need? So again, it seems like we are creating technologies that we're not fit to care for. If you recognize, like so many of us do, that raising a kid is confronting the fact that you're going to harm someone in a deep way because you're not a perfect parent, why think that you could create a technology that could affect a huge amount of people without any sort of interpersonal connectivity? The arrogance is off the scale, off the charts. But if you see people as bits of data, it's not going to be hard to consider them as something less than human. AI mental health chatbots, there's a whole bunch of them already on the market. Wobot, Wysa, Tess, Vivabot, they've all been used for several years for mental health. Now here's what I find to be really, really interesting here. It's inevitable that these AI are going to be used for therapeutic purposes even more so. What's also inevitable is that this technology is going to be, and has already begun, being programmed for use as a spiritual guide, for a pastor, for the replacement of a priest or a spiritual director. Two of the leading scholars on this movement, what's being called spirit tech, Wesley Wildman and Katie Stockley, write this: whether we welcome it or fear it, the era in which we can use technology to induce, intensify, and even control spiritual experience has arrived. Already we routinely rely on technology to manage our health, sleep, moods, relationship, calendars, travel, and finances, so it's really no surprise that we're turning to high-tech aids for the spiritual journey. As these innovations are rapidly proliferating and becoming ever more sophisticated, We are on the brink of the next and potentially most transformative revolution in the practice of religion, an era in which technological advancements merge with spiritual seeking. Now, in many of these studies that have been performed over the past 8 to 10 years, there is strong empirical evidence that shows that as long as we can continue to map the neural correlates of consciousness, which there's a probability that tells us we'll be able to do that with specific regions of the brain, you're going to have apps that are going to be able to induce religious experiences that the individual report as being more euphoric and more in harmony with God than any experience that they've ever had in the church or in the monastery or anything like that. The technology is not far off. There are already apps that some of us actually might be using that are mining data for this. If you have any of the sort of apps that help you gain a sense of calm and peace, those actually might be really helpful. I'm not saying they aren't. But they're mining data to correlate the statistics on how it is that people report a sense of felt well-being with a particular sort of image or rhythm or sound and rhythm of the sound that's displayed on your smartphone. The assumption behind spirit tech research is that once we map these neural mechanisms of religious experience, we'll be able to induce these. Here's another way to put the problem. Imagine that you have right now in your pocket a person, let's just say, that knows Scripture better than any pastor you could ever meet, whatever that means to know Scripture better, but also has insight into all the patterns of your behavior because you feed it that. It knows when you're most frustrated. It knows when you need sleep. It knows when you feel more depressed or more elated. It can track all of that. It knows when you eat, when you'll feel better about that. It knows the statistical correlation between when someone reads this passage of St. John of the Cross or prays the Jesus prayer at this particular time of day, they're going to feel or going to report feeling a greater sense of peace. Well, now you've given people at least the illusion of a religious experience that so many people are chasing after, but one, either don't find, or two, want to find the button to keep making it happen, wanting to return back to the religious experience. Well, imagine it's in your pocket. Well, where are people going to go? We can't be so naive as to think that they're going to still stay in connectivity. At some point, I think they're going to come back to it. But I'm convinced that what's coming here is going to be one of the most difficult challenges that the church has faced in quite some time, because it's just not on the radar, for one. Two, the church has become a place that's lost track of the soul as well. The meta-narrative behind so much of Silicon Valley is that we live in what Max Weber describes as, quote, the mechanism of a world robbed of gods. And after robbing the world of gods, billions of dollars are now fueling AI projects aimed at creating gods from machines. So ironically, disparage over the human soul as a ghost in the machine has turned into boasting the creation of a god or gods in the machine. Everything has been mechanized. In her widely lauded book, God, Human, Animal, Machine, Megan Giblin observes, quote, "It's meaningless to speak of the soul in the 21st century. It has become a dead metaphor, one of those words that survive in language long after culture has lost faith in the concept." Well, now what's wrong with that? Well, one is the assumption that the term soul is a metaphor in the first place, that it doesn't pick out something real in the world. Now, if you reduce something to, that's a linguistic reduction. You take something that's real in the world and you reduce it to just talk about something. Well, you can talk a lot about things that don't exist. That move right there is a cultural move away from the soul. She says that it's become a dead metaphor, one of those words that survive in language long after culture has lost faith in the concept. And she thinks that losing faith in the concept is a way that terms become obsolete because they don't have any real practical value anymore. I think that what I'm arguing here is showing that it's actually the opposite. Getting rid of the soul and acting if the soul is merely a dead metaphor and not treating it as something that's at the center of human life actually has profound significance. Profound significance. Dallas Willard, and if you're going to give a talk for the Willard Center, it's obligatory that you quote him. He says this: "Those who deny the soul still have to live a life. And they need to find the resources for it. If they cannot deal with the need in terms of a healthy soul, they still have to deal with it in some terms. What shall those terms be? They have to find them in one way or another, and not always are equal. The soul will strike back. The soul will strike back. So I think that it's becoming clearer and clearer to us, and we're realizing even more, and this is the case of disillusionment. We're seeing these idols fall, but we don't have much other place to look, and in large part because there is radical, I don't even know if you could even call it skepticism anymore, but a sort of, like in French you might just sort of say like bouf, like it's just sort of indifference and like towards people that want to try to explain how the world is and how to interact with it. Because the assumption is, we won't use these terms, but it is that they will treat me like a mechanism to get some sort of thing from me, some sort of behavior modification. Now, on this view of what the soul is, in just another 10 minutes, I want to explain how the soul can work on all of these things. And I'm going to try to take a whole book that I wrote for my dissertation and try to give it to you in 8 minutes. But so here's the way to think about it. So the number one problem in neuroscience, and it's the problem that just cannot be solved, is the binding problem, or what philosophers of consciousness call the unity of problem of consciousness. And the problem is pretty straightforward. So you've got the neural correlates of consciousness tell us that there are all these different regions of your brain that are responsible for different kinds of perceptions, different kinds of experience, right? Your awareness of shape is located over here, and your awareness of red is right here, and somehow you will have an experience of a red cube. But the big mystery is there's no thing in the brain that could, in principle, be responsible for having that experience, because the experiences are highly aggregated into and segregated off from each other, literally walled off from each other in different rooms. So it would be something like this. Imagine that you've got 10 people, and you've got a sentence that's got 10 words in it. And you tell each person one word, and only one word, and it's a different word from the rest of them. So individually, they've all got one of the words in the sentence. But it seems radically implausible that this group, just by each individual knowing one of those words, then knows the whole sentence, right? Or think about it, you might try to get away with this if you're a student. Imagine you've got a quiz that's got 20 questions on it. And you've got 20 people, and each one of you gets the answer right to one question. Can you then grade this thing called the class now and say they aced the exam? No, there's really no class that knows the answers. There's really no group of people that knows the sentence. There's really no group of neurons that have my unified experience, because they are walled off from each other. It would be like the famous example that Ned Block comes up with is he just says, imagine that you know how many neurons are in a brain. And let's just say that you've got the same number of neurons in a brain in a particular nation. And you give each one of these people radios so that they can interact with each other in the same way that a neural network does. The conclusion from that is if you think that that's going to, in the same sense of the brain, become a sort of conscious thing, now you're going to have to think that the nation of China in his thought experiment, now becomes conscious, because the individual people act like neurons. Now that should strike us as radically implausible. Now that's a problem only for a particular view of the human person, where the person is an aggregate of these parts, these physical parts. If a human person is comprised of body and soul, then the soul has, one, it doesn't have parts to be segregated. Two, it draws anything up into itself to unify it. So another way to think about this, because this is an argument that's given against this soul talk, is that it's explanatorily useless in the sciences. But there's lots of ways to show that that's false. Here's one. If you didn't have any sort of experience of consciousness, and you just looked at a brain, your expectation would be that that anything that has a brain, that has an experience in virtue of that brain, won't experience the whole world at once. They'll have this shape experience at this time, this color experience at this time, this sound, this olfactory, all these sorts of different experiences that are segregated from one another. That's if you start with the bits of a brain and then try to theorize about what sort of kind of experience that thing would have. But if you start with the view of the soul, that a human person is a unified substance that doesn't have parts that can be segregated off, what you would expect that conscious life to have would be the exact kind of conscious life that we have, one of a unified whole. Right now you've got all sort of sensations that are coming into you at once, and there's a what it's like to experience them all at once. So the soul hypothesis predicts the kind of experiences that we've got right now, and the mechanistic hypothesis predicts the exact opposite of the kind of experiences that we have right now. It's late, and so I've tossed a lot of things out there, but what I'm trying to make a case for right now is that there is publicly available and testable knowledge about the existence and the reality of the soul. The argument that I've just given is that the main problem in neuroscience that no one can solve and most think cannot be solved is simply not a problem for the soul view. It just doesn't bump into that problem. It seems to harmonize with reality really, really well. But it also seems to get at this existential and societal, ethical, spiritual problem of mechanization. The soul, writes Hildegard of Bingen, is symphonic. The soul is symphonic. Neurons' mechanisms are not symphonic, and I think that we know that. Returning to the soul and away from mechanization helps us in various ways. One, we get insight in virtue of what a soul is, the radical truth that we all bump into, which is that we can't change by direct effort. Machines can change by direct effort. That's exactly what they do. They exhibit force in a particular way on some other object, and it changes. But we know from our own experience that's not how human beings change. That's not how a soul would change either, because there are no parts to be pushed and pulled on. The soul also has a particular fixed nature that doesn't yield to considerations of social construction. You will find out what it is that makes or constitutes the flourishing of a human person by understanding the nature, the essence of their soul. In the same way you would find out what it is that provides for the flourishing of a plant. But right now we're in a culture where it doesn't seem like you can say that there's a nature for a human person to study, much less a particular way to live that would bring about its flourishing in any way that can be known publicly or testable publicly across ideological divides. Now, what the soul hypothesis, I think, should do is become the sort of thing that ideological divides could gather around, and the divisions will start to collapse a bit once we've got something in reality to grab onto that would be unifying. The soul is an irreducible source of human life. The soul stays off disenchantment. If souls are real, and I think that there's the strongest case can be made that there are, and our own personal experience evidences this, the world is far stranger than what's delivered to us through technology. There's a source to life that's beyond the pushes and pulls of the things that we try to control, right? Now, this is the weird thing, too, is that you might think that technology is a pursuit to try to control things, and that's part of it. But most people that work on artificial intelligence recognize that the project they're producing, if it's going to succeed, will end in their total lack of control. There is a bizarre sort of cognitive dissonance going on there. This quest to sort of be our master, but to be our own masters, but then creating something that's going to become our own master. There is this very sort of perverted realization that we do need something to care for us, but we're not ready or willing to yield to be cared for the sort of thing that can care for us, but something that'll care for us on our own terms, even if we recognize that in all probability it will become the thing that destroys us. Now, I don't think machines can become conscious at all. I think there are good arguments to think that won't happen, so don't worry about that. I'll also say this, that this problem is no different than any other problem that can't be solved by spiritual formation. The church has had a corner on this and will continue to. But my argument here is that if we don't return to the soul, if we continue down the path of mechanization, the wisdom and insight and knowledge that Jesus makes available will continue to be as foreign to us as it was to Kohlenberg. The gospel will continue to be strange and bizarre. Here's my last argument. I think that Jesus' message often started out with the same sort of insight I'm trying to make right now. So if you thought I was doing anything clever, I'm just plagiarizing, I think, what Jesus taught. So think about the Sermon on the Mount. I think that what's going on in the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus' initial argument to say you cannot mechanize people, they need to be treated as people. What's going on there? There's a human tendency to reduce everything to pushes and pulls. You're in or you're out, based on things that don't have to do with you in terms of being a person, but in terms of factors that often are not the sorts of things that you choose. So if you're menstruating, sorry, you're outside of the effective range of God's will, as Dallas would tell us. You're not fit for the kingdom of God right now. Wait till you're not. If you've got leprosy, and some biblical scholars think that would be akin to having severe depression in our culture. If you've got that, sorry, you're not one of God's people, right? The argument there, the scribes and the Pharisees, was that if you were functioning a particular way, you couldn't be one of God's people. Now Jesus comes along and says, that's not at all what I'm about. Blessed are you that have these sorts of ailments. Not because these ailments are okay, not because these ailments, if you've got them, will make you holy, but because my holiness is available to you regardless of whether or not you've got these sorts of things. I don't work on pushes and pulls. I work with people, and people don't work on pushes and pulls. That's not how it works. The kingdom of God does not get expressed or realized in subpersonal mechanizations. It can come and heal those things, but it'll heal the person that has those things. It won't heal those things and mistake those things as the person. And what we've got right now is mistaking the ailments for the person, right? Again, this is the heart of what people struggle with in serious depression. They identify themselves not as a self, but identical to their trauma or what's wrong or broken with them. And Jesus turns this around with the woman at the well. You're not reducible to the illicit relationships that you've had. You're a person, and your dignity is carried in that, and I will take that heart of stone and give it a heart of flesh. Or I think this is another way to think about Jesus' teaching about take care of the inside of the cup and the outside will take care of itself. You take care of what is at the heart of the person, and the bits that function on the outside will be made whole and unified by the soul. So I don't want to put my work too much in Jesus' words. I don't want to do that. But what I do think I am doing is taking the fundamental sort of insight about reality that Jesus had and applied to the situation at the time and say that it applies to this time just as well. And the problem of trying to mechanize things to outsource our humanity, outsource our accountability, outsource our frustration, our inability to cure ourselves by pushing on, finding mechanisms to push on who's in and out, is the same sort of problem that we're seeing today just showing up in our technology. Maybe the greater difficulty is that we've just got, with the technology now, a much bigger stick to hurt a greater number of people with. And this becomes a bigger problem, but I think it'll also become a distraction. One of the big distractions of the internet and social media, too, is that it exposes me not to people, but to problems that I don't interact with on a daily basis. That is, it exposes me to an amount of suffering that I can recognize is totally beyond my capability to even be present with those people, and I can't bear it. But it's easy for me to outsource my compassion by posting the right thing or liking the right thing or putting up the right banner. And then I don't have the bandwidth then, if that's the right way to understand this, to care for the person right in front of me. Or perhaps it's easier to care for people in the Twitter sphere, whatever you want to call that, and to mistake that for caring for a person versus caring for the people that are right in front of me. That when I see them face to face, present me with something that is brilliant and beautiful, that should be cherished, that I should desire unity with, and that I should care for in a real sense. That is, things that I really should love, that I'm capable of loving. So return back to the overview effect. Shatner literally had no place to stand. He had no place to stand. The world is much like ours, a mechanistic one, where there isn't anything of use or of unity to stand on. And that's what a lack of knowledge about the human person will do. A lack of knowledge of the human soul will drain the world of its meaning and understanding about the activity of God. I'll leave you with this quote from Julian of Norwich. "We may never come to full knowledge of God till we first clearly know our own soul." And I think if you wrestle with that for a while, you'll come to realize that's the case. I've gone on for too long, but that's what philosophers do, so sorry. Thanks for your time.
We do have some time for Q&A for those of you who can stay. I think I will let our speaker field his own questions, unless you get unruly.
Oh, no. Rachel.
Thanks, Brandon. That was great. I was wondering if I could sort of press a little bit about this. I guess I don't really understand what you mean by testable. Because,
Good.
I mean, so, I remember the first time I read Thomas on the soul, and he's like, yeah, of course we're in soul. What's the difference between a living person and a corpse, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, to me, it's such a simple example in a certain way, especially somebody who's just died. But you can show that, and I mean I agree with you about like the soul hypothesis, much more in accord with reality.
Mm-hmm.
But so, or you can use Thomas's example about what's the difference between a person and a corpse. You can show people that all day long. They're still going to sort of come back and say, oh no, it's like and explain with mechanistic or some personal category. So
Yes.
I guess I don't really understand what you mean by testable.
Yeah, good. And part of that comes from just Thomas's view of self-knowledge. So I think that Thomas is going to mislead us on this.
Okay.
So I would just say that what I take to be testable about this is one, you can argue for a hypothesis by testing its contradiction. So it's either personal or mechanistic, and we can test the mechanistic one out, and if that fails, then we're left with the personal one. That might be one way to go about testing it. Another way to go about testing it would just be, let's just, like with the case of the unity of consciousness, here's the testable hypothesis. If the soul is real, here's what we should predict. Here's the outcome. It turns out that our experience of consciousness is just like that. Now, Thomas won't be able to do that because his understanding of self-awareness does not reveal the nature of the self as an immaterial substance. But I think that would be a shortcoming of Thomas, not a shortcoming of the notion that the soul is testable. Another way to do it, just as one other example, would just be to test, well, what are the mechanistic ways of trying to unify a person? And they all fail miserably. What would be the way of unifying a person on the soul hypothesis? Those practices we know work.
Right. Let me just maybe rephrase a little bit. So I guess my question is, when you say testable, is it testable for, you said publicly testable, I believe,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I guess my question is, you can make that argument, which I think is a great one, but somebody is going to come back at you and be like, no, it's just, quarks and
Right.
et cetera. So like, where do you do with that? Like, you're sort of like,
Yeah.
reality's right here, man.
Good.
So.
Yeah, so that's life. There's no argument you could give anyone that they couldn't make the same thing. Well, I just reject that. I mean, that's just what it means to be irrational about something if the argument is really good. So
Right.
it's nothing about the soul, the testability of the soul. That's just the testability of reality. Reality is testable in a way that it's not going to reveal, it's not going to give itself, it's going to give you space to reject it. That's just the nature of reality and the nature of its knowability. And that I take to be a great strength of it, not a weakness, because it provides then the space for humans to be agents and not be dominated by reality. So, which I think provides for the phenomenological space that knowledge requires. So I would see that as a pro, not a con. The other thing maybe if I didn't make it clear is that by testability I'm not thinking empirical in the contemporary sense of empirical. Right? So that's just the testability of mathematics, the testability that domestic violence is a evil. You can test that. I can come to know that by experience, but it's not anything I have to go to a neuroscientist to know. I just experience that. That's what I'm meaning by. And it's publicly available in the same way that beauty is. I just put someone in the perspective to experience it if they're willing to. Yeah. Brittany.
Will you go as far as to say the soul is naturally eternal?
No, I don't think there's any good reason to think that's the case. Yeah. It certainly doesn't logically follow from the fact that the soul is partless that it is naturally eternal. Yeah. I think that's just a historical contingency that people read onto views of the soul that just come from particularly like Enlightenment philosophers that were trying to argue for the afterlife, the reliability of the Christian view of afterlife from the argument of the soul. But that's the reverse. It's not that because you get a soul you get eternal life. It's that eternal life requires a soul. Is the way you could think about it. Yeah. So it's not that there's a natural eternality to a soul just because it's partless or is a soul. Is that helpful or? Okay. What's your name?
I'm Michelle.
Michelle. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, I'm wondering, have you read Wendell Berry?
A bit.
What are you reading for?
A bit. Yeah, I would not be able to speak intelligently on him though.
And likewise, in the arts, I'm thinking of Marilyn Robinson.
I've got some citations of hers I was going to use. Yeah, I just ran out of time.
Her essays on the givenness of things.
Yes.
It seems like somehow there must be more of an intersection between what is the soul, what is neuroscience, and then the time that we're living in.
Mm-hmm.
That's the premise of her book, is the spirit of our time.
Yes.
And it's fascinating to just see how much the arts and works of literature have dealt with it from such a long other way, at a different time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering just if you work with that.
Yes, I think that's, so one of the things that I love about, so she makes this argument, she says, in several places she says, there are more neurons in the brain than there are stars in the sky. And if we marvel at the stars, then we should marvel at the brain. And then she says, though, but consciousness is far more brilliant than the brain, and so we should marvel at that. And she thinks that to be like at the core of a person. So she's saying persons are just beautiful and brilliant in that way. And so that's not to reject that neuroscience can deliver us great goods, right? I think that they can deliver us great goods. They just don't give us any insight into what a person is or how a person flourishes, right? It just isn't, that's just not what it's supposed to be used for. With the arts, what I find really fascinating is that when I read good poetry, what resonates in me is not that the ink on that page was so fascinating. For me, it's more like, that person gets me. I feel seen in some way, or I feel like I see you in some way. It's way past the page. It's way past the page. And think of it this way. You could, if the soul hypothesis is that the souls are false, and we're just mechanisms, well, art is just unnecessary. All I need is the right kind of pill to give me the same kind of experience that I had with seeing a sunset or seeing, this is so weird. If you've gone and seen the Mona Lisa since the invention of the iPhone, it's a totally different experience. Because you get funneled in, like it's nice so you get a moment with it. No one's having the moment, everyone's doing this. Right? And then if that, then there's also this beautiful painting of the apostles off to the left that like no one even looks at, right? You're like, that's tragedy, right? So and when I said the internet is not a new thing, like Descartes foresaw this. He said, people only go on vacations to come back and tell people they went on vacations. He knew about Instagram way before, Instagram. But that's the thing. The way that Instagram works with art, too. It's, oh yeah, I've seen that, scroll. Oh yeah, like that, scroll, like it, scroll. If it's just mechanisms like that, then a neuroscientist will help me bypass the experiences of art and beauty. I just don't think that's possible. But now translate it to the Christian life. The neuroscientist just has to figure out how to solve my sanctification in terms of my brain states. Now, that gets us into a heresy, but also it just seems radically implausible.
I was thinking about pandemic and in process of the mechanisms and this collision of just everything that we've gone through. It's so hard for the mind to kind of know how to make sense of it. But one of the most powerful things that I've thought about is just the difference between a mechanism and politics and division and everything that we've kind of seen is a stop. And how powerful that was
Mm-hmm.
to have a no. Like the mechanisms aren't going to stop. A machine doesn't stop. So what becomes wisdom and what becomes almost is so profound to say stop.
Well, I think part of it is, so think about Jesus on the Sea of Galilee and think about the ship as technology. The technology can go down and I still have a really wonderful life. But likewise, the technology can still be working and we have a really wonderful and beautiful life. So the technology is something that we have to be really mindful about, how we interact with it and how we treat others. But I think that the gospel just says, like, blessed are those who still have iPhones, in the sense of this thing will not undermine my flourishing if I can understand how I can relate to it correctly. And it might be getting rid of one and getting a flip phone, right? That's the discussion down the road that I think we need to have. But I don't ever want to say that a bit of technology is bigger than the kingdom of God. I don't ever want to get down that road. Yeah, I don't know if that's helpful or not, but that's what comes to mind. Brandon.
So, thank you, Brandon. I'm working through a couple statements that you made, all of which are very interesting. One was, people know they matter, but they can't explain why.
Yeah.
Right? So they know they matter. You made a statement, I think, casually within the context of the lecture, but it implies that they do have knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
That they matter, but they don't know why. If people know that they matter, and they don't know why, but they have knowledge, and Dallas would say, you don't have to know why, they have knowledge of something.
Mm-hmm.
What do we need to make the knowledge people already have publicly available?
Yeah.
So they have the knowledge already, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have daily experiences with this.
Mm-hmm.
We know that we matter to our children. It may not rise to a level of significance that's eternal within certain worldviews, but we know we matter in that sense. But why isn't that yet publicly available? There's another question I had, and I don't want to take too many, so if there are others, or you could ignore this one. Is concerning whether you think mechanism itself automatically excludes value.
Mm.
So one
Mhm.
And if you would confer personhood on a sentient artificial intelligence, but yet that's a mechanistic, right, form of personhood maybe, is there maybe room for a version of the human person that includes mechanistic explanations to some extent, even while there's still room for soul, that's
Yeah.
internal, that can help to bridge some of the divide? Because I think part of what's going on is claims from the dominant empirical worldview that is attempting really, in some ways, to do good. I'm not saying it's doing good, but it's attempting to do good. It's attempting to learn about who we are
Mhm.
so that problems that confront us can be resolved. And some of those solutions are going to lead us astray, as in the over-medication of people for problems that require therapeutic treatment of another kind, or these apps you're referring to, right?
Mhm.
But the impulse there is in some ways to learn and to uncover something that is true
Mhm.
about human life.
Mhm.
And there might be a way, I guess I'm suggesting, that the mechanism itself, it may not be entirely and always necessarily divorced from value.
Oh, certainly.
Right?
I think that it's, so those are really good questions, and I think you got more than two going on there. But so the first one is, you can make a distinction between knowledge being publicly available and making knowledge publicly available, right? So I think everyone can know what's real, but that's different than me making that available to people. In one sense, in terms of turning their attention towards what's real, or also helping them develop the kind of character and passions and desires that's sensitive towards what's real, that will really start to care about living in harmony with what's real, and or being accountable to what's real. So, I want to say knowledge of things is out there, and it speaks to us all the time, and we live life based on that, even if we don't want to acknowledge it. But there's a mode of presence in the world where I point these things out and I display it. I make it available to people in the sense of I'm drawing their awareness to it. So, and I think that plays into another dynamic of your question, which was people know these sorts of things, but why don't they act on it or something? They know that they're valuable, but why don't they act that out?
They do act on it, actually. So, like, somebody will strive to stay alive because they know they have a family that values
Right.
them, right? We protect people from things like pandemics because we value human beings. Like, there's all kinds of ways in which it publicly manifests that we do, in fact, assign value to people, even if we don't know why. So, I mean, part of the trouble, right, is there is an argument that mechanism, reducing people to mechanism, somehow drains them, right, of value. And one line here was that people are treated as mechanisms, and the point was is that they can be harmed, basically, right?
Yeah, so I don't want to say it drains them of value. That's the tragedy, is that they are valuable and they're not being treated
Right.
as valuable in the way that they're valuable.
That's what I mean
Yeah.
by brain, yeah.
Yeah, so it doesn't, the value's there. The tragedy is that I undermine its flourishing. So, so let me try to answer I think I lost track of the second question. I think that one.
The second question had to do with artificial intelligence.
Oh, right, yeah.
And mechanism.
Yeah.
And to what extent, like, is mechanism for you
Yeah,
is self-sufficient
yeah,
to exclude the kind of value that you're after? Like, this idea, as
Yeah.
I understood the argument, was part of the problem is that we're not appreciating what a person is, and that relates to this idea of subpersonal category, right? And that when we go in that direction,
yeah,
we mistake people
right,
for qualities that are mechanistic, when in fact a person is distinct from that.
yeah,
But maybe you have this example of artificial intelligence, which is now sentient, and the problem would be if it becomes sentient, we might have ethical obligations even to artificial intelligence.
We have ethical obligations to it if it isn't sentient as well, because imagine creating a machine that's in charge of ethical decisions that has no ethical sensitivities, because it's not conscious. So it cuts both ways. But so if there was really good reason to think that an AI became conscious, I would just in principle, have reasons to think that it isn't in virtue of its mechanisms that it is. In the same way that I'm conscious, not in virtue of my brain and its mechanisms.
The challenge for me there, though, is like we know that we're created by God, and there are qualities to us
Yeah.
that are, in some respect, they're just non-empirical,
Mhm.
right? But how would you imagine AI that develops consciousness and is just in principle situated that
Yeah, I
it's
wouldn't.
a non-empirical source for its consciousness?
Right. So long discussion, but just take it in terms of us biologically. So how is it that God creates us, right? You've got two dominant views, a Traducian and creationist view. On the Traducian view, you're sort of like literally a chip off the old block. Like you get your soul literally from your parents. But it's imbued in the teleology of biological organisms as such that they are conscious things. It's not in virtue of the mechanisms. It's in virtue of the irreducible teleology or on the creationist view, it's this biological thing comes about and God creates the soul there, right? And so that could be the exact same story for an AI, right? So the origin story, that's one that so it reminds me of when Darwin brought back a primate and met with a priest, and the priest said, "Speak to me and I'll baptize you," right? It looks like you could be another kind of person. Yeah, I've got reasons in principle to think that's just not at all possible. And so the other questions that I think are actual are at the level of how we treat them, knowing they're not going to be conscious. But maybe I'm not answering your question.
No, I think you've given me a good bit.
Just in for a moment, we're rapidly approaching the end of our time, and I think we might have time for one or possibly two more short questions. So I think we had a bit of a queue. So
Yeah.
the man in the green over here had.
There's two greens. Yeah.
I did have a question.
What's your name?
Spencer.
Spencer. Thanks for coming, Spencer. Yeah.
It's relating to the pandemic, and I think that one of the major things that kind of happened during the pandemic is a sense of isolation.
Yeah.
Us being told to fear other people because we might catch this illness. And I guess my question is just how do you think isolation fits into this story of mechanization?
Yeah, so I want to be very careful to not speak as a sociologist or a psychologist. So so this is, just for legal reasons, I don't want to be held accountable for any, don't implement any of my ideas. So I want to say that, so what I was mentioning before comes from this philosopher Levinas, that in the face of the other person, I meet this ethical demand. It's in seeing another person that I see their humanity, but I also recognize my humanity as someone needs to treat them that way. Part of what being isolated from other people does is that it makes the world more impersonal, and along with it, my humanity becomes less and less present to me. But what's unique about our situation, though, is that the Spirit is available to us as a person. And what I found fascinating with some of my friends in this room, too, is we had this little cohort that met once, and then the lockdowns happened, and we couldn't meet again, but we got together on Zoom. And there was something that the Spirit did with us, I think, and also in virtue of the kind of community that just started in a real intentional way, where we gathered together in a more intimate way than we would have expected if you just put it on paper. And so the Spirit of God works through these in ways that overcome our, that's not to downplay how horrible it was for us to be displaced and away from each other. And the mere fact that part of the cure was the thing that we were so scared of getting to other people. But that's part of what I would say. It also, the ethical activity of your life is sort of drained away a bit, because now I'm not around people that I can impact. It's easier for me, I can just, it's funny because we'll say, well, I don't have to wear pants on Zoom, I just have to wear this up here. There's no ethical responsibility to wear pants, but that's like a really low bar. There's others too, I just don't need to show up as being present with another person. I can just veg, on Netflix. I lose the great good of being present to other people as a person and being attentive to them as people to me, which in part is like part of how we flourish. So it's a really good question. But not as a psychologist. That was just as a philosopher. So.
I think we're going to have to leave it there. Before we thank Brandon for this very interesting, thought-provoking lecture, I do want to affirm, from the Westmont point of view, the importance of the obligation to wear pants.